What if I told you that just across the border from the United States, in a quiet corner of Canada, there was a place that trained some of the most dangerous people who ever lived? A place where ordinary citizens learned to kill silently, sabotage infrastructure, forge documents, break codes, and disappear without a trace. A place so secret that it didn't officially exist. This place was real, and it changed the course of World War II and the entire future of espionage. It was called Camp X, and it was the first modern spy training facility in North America. Between 1941 and 1945, hundreds of Allied agents passed through this secret facility on the shores of Lake Ontario in Canada. They learned skills that would terrify you: how to kill a man with your bare hands in under 3 seconds, how to create explosives from household items, how to withstand torture, how to assume a completely new identity, how to blend into enemy territory and commit acts of sabotage that would cripple Nazi Germany. Some of the men and women trained at Camp X became legends in the intelligence world. Others died in occupied Europe, their names never recorded, their sacrifices never publicly acknowledged. But together they formed the foundation of modern espionage as we know it today. Camp X was where Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, observed training operations that would later inspire his famous spy novels. It was where thousands of secret messages were transmitted between Churchill and Roosevelt. It was where the techniques used by the CIA, MI6, and every modern intelligence agency were first developed and perfected. But here's the most remarkable part. For decades, Camp X didn't officially exist. The Canadian government denied its existence. Documents were destroyed or classified. The land was sold and redeveloped. The people who trained there were sworn to secrecy, and most took those secrets to their graves. It wasn't until the 1980s that the full story of Camp X began to emerge. Declassified documents, interviews with aging veterans, and investigative journalism gradually revealed the truth about this extraordinary place. This is the story of Camp X, how it was created, what happened within its fences, the legendary spies it produced, and how it laid the foundation for modern intelligence warfare. This is a story of ordinary people who became extraordinary agents, of innovation born from desperation, and of secrets that were kept for over 40 years. Welcome to the world of real espionage. Forget James Bond's gadgets and glamorous casinos. Real spies were trained in a muddy field in Canada, learning brutal skills for a brutal war. And what they learned at Camp X changed the world forever. To understand why Camp X was created, we need to go back to 1940, one of the darkest years in modern history. By June 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered most of Western Europe. France had fallen. The Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, all occupied. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine, facing the very real possibility of invasion. Winston Churchill, who had just become Prime Minister in May 1940, understood something crucial. Britain couldn't defeat Nazi Germany through conventional military means alone. The Germans had more troops, more tanks, more aircraft. They controlled vast resources from occupied territories. Britain was outnumbered and outgunned. But Churchill had a radical idea: unconventional warfare. If Britain couldn't match Germany's military strength, it would fight in the shadows. Sabotage, subversion, assassination, guerrilla warfare, psychological operations. These would be Britain's weapons. In July 1940, Churchill created the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Its mission, in Churchill's words, was to set Europe ablaze. The SOE would recruit, train, and deploy agents into occupied Europe to conduct sabotage, organize resistance movements, gather intelligence, and create chaos behind enemy lines. There was just one problem. Britain didn't know how to do this at scale. They had intelligence services like MI6, but these focused on traditional espionage, recruiting foreign agents, gathering information, analysis. The SOE needed something different. Ordinary civilians transformed into saboteurs and guerrilla fighters who could operate independently in enemy territory. Britain needed to create spies, and they needed to create them fast. But where? Britain itself was vulnerable to German bombing and potential invasion. Training facilities in England risked being discovered or destroyed. And there was another complication: the United States. In 1940, America was still neutral. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but isolationist sentiment was strong. The U.S. couldn't openly participate in British military operations. But Roosevelt and Churchill had a close relationship, and they communicated secretly about how America could help without officially entering the war. This is where Canada became crucial. Canada was already at war, having declared war on Germany in September 1939. Canada was part of the British Commonwealth, but geographically close to the United States. And Canada had something Britain desperately needed: space, security, and proximity to America. Enter William Stephenson, a Canadian businessman and World War I flying ace who became one of the most important intelligence figures of the 20th century. Stephenson had moved in high social circles in Britain and had become alarmed by the Nazi threat in the 1930s. He had used his business connections to gather intelligence on German rearmament and passed it to British intelligence. When war broke out, Stephenson was recruited by MI6 and sent to New York in 1940 to establish British intelligence operations in the Western Hemisphere. His cover was as a British passport control officer, but his real mission was far more significant: coordinate intelligence sharing with the Americans, conduct counterintelligence against German agents in the Americas, and establish training facilities for Allied agents. Stephenson's codename was Intrepid, and he would become the inspiration for Ian Fleming's James Bond character. Fleming worked with Stephenson during the war and was deeply impressed by him. Stephenson proposed establishing a secret training facility in Canada that could serve multiple purposes: train SOE agents for deployment into occupied Europe, train American intelligence officers, which couldn't officially happen in the U.S. while America was neutral, establish secure communications between Roosevelt and Churchill, develop and test new espionage techniques and equipment, and create a blueprint for modern intelligence training. The Canadians agreed. They would provide the land and security, the British would provide the expertise and curriculum, and the Americans would provide unofficial support and send their own intelligence officers for training, preparing for the day that when America would inevitably enter the war. In December 1941, a remote 275-acre farm on the shores of Lake Ontario, just outside the town of Whitby, Ontario, was quietly acquired. It was close enough to Toronto for logistics, but remote enough for security. It was near the U.S. border, but in Canadian territory. And it was about to become the birthplace of modern espionage. The locals were told it was a military communications facility. No one outside a small circle of officials knew the truth. Construction began immediately using military personnel who were sworn to secrecy. By early 1942, the facility was operational. Its official designation was STS-103, Special Training School 103. But everyone who knew about it called it Camp X. And what happened there would change espionage forever. So what exactly happened at Camp X? What did agents learn there? And how were they transformed from ordinary citizens into deadly operatives? The training at Camp X was unlike anything that had existed before. It combined elements from multiple disciplines: military combat training, police investigative techniques, criminal tradecraft, and psychological manipulation. The curriculum was constantly evolving, based on feedback from agents in the field and lessons learned from operations. A typical training course lasted several weeks to several months, depending on the agent's assignment. But every day was intense, exhausting, and designed to push trainees to their limits. Let's walk through what a trainee at Camp X would experience. First, there was physical conditioning. Agents needed to be in peak physical condition to survive in the field. The training was brutal. Long-distance running, swimming in the frigid waters of Lake Ontario regardless of weather, obstacle courses, hand-to-hand combat practice for hours each day. This wasn't gym class. It was preparation for life-or-death situations. Close-quarters combat was taught by some of the most dangerous men in the world. The chief instructor for this was William Fairburn, a British police officer who had spent decades in Shanghai, one of the most violent cities in the world at that time. Fairburn had survived over 600 street fights and had developed a system of combat designed for one purpose: killing an opponent quickly and silently. The Fairburn system, which would later influence every modern close-quarters combat system used by military and intelligence services, taught techniques that were shockingly efficient and brutal. Students learned how to kill a man with their bare hands in seconds using strikes to vital points. They learned knife-fighting techniques designed for assassination. They learned how to disarm opponents and use improvised weapons. One technique involved approaching an enemy from behind and killing them silently with a specific knife strike to the subclavian artery. Another involved breaking an opponent's neck with a precise twist. These weren't movie techniques. These were real methods that worked, and students practiced them repeatedly until they became instinctive. Firearms training was extensive. Agents learned to use a variety of weapons: pistols, rifles, submachine guns, and specialized silenced weapons, but this wasn't target practice. It was combat shooting. Students learned to shoot accurately while moving, while under stress, in darkness, and in close quarters. They practiced double-tap shooting, 2 rapid shots to the center mass that would become standard practice for intelligence and special operations forces. Demolitions and sabotage training was crucial. Agents learned how to make explosives from common materials, how to sabotage railways, bridges, factories, and vehicles, and how to create maximum disruption with minimal resources. They learned the precise placement of explosives to bring down buildings or derail trains. They practiced sabotage techniques on real equipment brought to Camp X for training purposes. One instructor, George Durlot, was an expert in industrial sabotage. He taught agents how to identify critical vulnerabilities in factories, power plants, and transportation systems. A small amount of explosive in exactly the right place could shut down production for weeks. A handful of ball bearings dropped into machinery could cause catastrophic failures. Silent killing techniques extended beyond hand-to-hand combat. Agents learned to use specialized weapons like the well-rod pistol, a nearly silent assassination weapon, and the Fairburn Sykes fighting knife, designed specifically for silent killing. They learned garroting techniques using wire or cord. They learned how to kill sentries silently so infiltration teams could move through enemy territory. But Camp X wasn't just about physical skills. Much of the training focused on the psychological and intellectual aspects of espionage. Tradecraft was perhaps the most important subject. This covered everything an agent needed to survive and operate in enemy territory: how to establish a cover identity and maintain it under questioning, how to recognize and evade surveillance, how to make dead drops in secret communications, how to recruit and manage resistance networks, how to gather intelligence without arousing suspicion. Students learned interrogation resistance. They were subjected to mock interrogations that were psychologically brutal, though not physically torturous, to prepare them for capture. They learned techniques to resist giving information, to mislead interrogators, and to maintain their cover story under pressure. Lockpicking, safe-cracking, breaking and entering, all the skills of professional burglars were taught. Agents needed to access enemy documents and facilities without leaving evidence of intrusion. They practiced on a variety of locks and safes, learning to open them quickly and quietly. Document forgery was crucial. Agents learned to forge identity papers, travel documents, and official stamps. They studied the details of German and other Axis documents so they could create convincing forgeries or spot enemy forgeries. Code and cipher training taught agents basic cryptography for field communications. While professional code breakers handled complex ciphers, field agents needed to encode and decode simple messages for security. Photography and intelligence gathering taught agents how to surreptitiously photograph documents, installations, and personnel. They learned to use concealed cameras and to memorize information when photography wasn't possible. Cultural training prepared agents for their specific assignments. Those going to France learned French language, customs, and current conditions in occupied France. Those going to other regions received appropriate preparation. The goal was to be indistinguishable from locals. Psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect. Instructors worked to develop the mental resilience agents would need in the field. They taught agents to live with constant fear, to make life-or-death decisions instantly, to cope with isolation, and to accept that they might be captured and killed. They were taught that if captured, they should try to hold out for 48 hours before breaking under interrogation. This would give their networks time to disperse and change security procedures. After 48 hours, they were expected to break. Everyone breaks eventually. But those 48 hours could save lives. Perhaps the darkest training was the L pill, the lethal cyanide capsule that agents could use to commit suicide if capture was imminent. Agents were taught when they might choose to use it, though the decision was always theirs. The pill was concealed in various ways: in a fake tooth, sewn into clothing, hidden in jewelry. The intensity of Camp X training created a unique culture. Trainees formed close bonds, knowing they were preparing for extraordinary dangers together. Many would later say that their time at Camp X was the most intense experience of their lives, more intense even than combat operations. The instructors at Camp X were legends. Besides Fairburn, there was Eric Sykes, who developed weapons and close combat techniques. There were former criminals who taught lockpicking and breaking and entering. There were psychologists who taught interrogation and resistance. There were communications experts who taught radio operation and codes. The training was effective. Agents from Camp X conducted some of the most successful operations of World War II. They organized resistance movements in occupied countries, conducted sabotage that crippled German war production, assassinated high-value targets, and gathered intelligence that saved countless Allied lives. But Camp X wasn't just a training facility. It was also home to HYDRA, one of the most important secret communication stations of the war. And that's a story that deserves its own chapter. While the spy training at Camp X was remarkable, there was another aspect of the facility that was equally important, but even more secret: HYDRA. HYDRA was the code name for a state-of-the-art radio communications station built at Camp X in 1942. It became the primary secret communications link between North America and Britain, handling thousands of classified messages throughout the war. To understand HYDRA's importance, you need to understand the challenge of secure long-distance communication in the 1940s. There was no internet, no satellites, no secure phone lines across the Atlantic. If Churchill in London wanted to send a secret message to Roosevelt in Washington, how could he do it? Regular diplomatic channels were vulnerable to interception. German intelligence was monitoring communications constantly. Even encoded messages sent through normal channels could be intercepted, and while they might not be decoded immediately, the very fact that a message was sent could reveal information. What was needed was a completely separate, ultra-secure communications channel that Germany didn't even know existed. That's what HYDRA became. The facility was built with cutting-edge technology for its time. The main building housed powerful radio transmitters and receivers capable of communicating with Britain, the United States, and eventually locations across the globe. The equipment included multiple high-power radio transmitters and receivers operating on different frequencies, encryption and decryption machines, including modified versions of the ROCX cipher machine, teletype equipment for high-speed message transmission, emergency power generators to ensure continuous operation, and sophisticated antenna arrays designed to maximize signal strength and minimize detection. HYDRA operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout the war. Radio operators worked in shifts, constantly transmitting and receiving encrypted messages. The volume was staggering, thousands of messages per month, each encrypted, transmitted, received, and decrypted. The security around HYDRA was extraordinary. The radio operators were carefully screened and sworn to secrecy. They knew they were handling important encrypted traffic, but they didn't know the content of the messages. They just transmitted and received code groups. The actual encryption and decryption happened in a separate secure section of the facility, handled by specialized communications officers. Messages sent through HYDRA included communications between Churchill and Roosevelt on war strategy, often before America officially entered the war. Intelligence reports from agents in occupied Europe, orders and instructions to SOE agents in the field, coordination of major military operations, sensitive diplomatic communications, updates on code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park in England. One of HYDRA's most important functions was providing secure communications for the British Security Coordination, BSC, William Stephenson's intelligence organization based in New York. The BSC was conducting extensive intelligence and counterintelligence operations throughout the Americas, and HYDRA gave them a secure way to communicate with London without using compromised channels. HYDRA also served as a training facility for signals intelligence personnel. Radio operators and communication specialists from allied countries trained at Camp X to operate similar equipment that would be deployed elsewhere. This was particularly important for Americans preparing for the eventual creation of what would become the CIA. The technology at HYDRA was advanced enough that it continued to be used after the war. While the spy training aspects of Camp X were scaled down in 1944 as the focus shifted to post-war planning, HYDRA remained operational well into the Cold War era, eventually becoming a Canadian signals intelligence station. The Germans never discovered HYDRA's existence during the war. They detected radio signals from North America, of course, but they couldn't locate the specific source or break the encryption. The combination of physical security, encryption security, and operational security kept HYDRA safe throughout the war. There's a fascinating postscript to HYDRA's story. In 1945, a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Guzenko defected from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. He brought with him documents proving that the Soviet Union was running extensive spy networks in Canada and the West. This was one of the first major revelations of Soviet espionage and helped trigger the Cold War. Guzenko's debriefing took place at Camp X, in part because it was one of the most secure locations in North America. The communications capabilities of HYDRA allowed intelligence services to coordinate their response to Guzenko's revelations in real time. This shows how Camp X evolved from a World War II facility to a Cold War asset. The skills and systems developed there for fighting Nazi Germany would be adapted to the new conflict with the Soviet Union. But the physical facility couldn't last forever, and the story of what happened to Camp X after the war reveals how governments handle inconvenient secrets. The real measure of Camp X's success wasn't the facilities or the training methods. It was the people who passed through its gates and what they accomplished in the field. Hundreds of agents trained at Camp X went on to conduct operations throughout occupied Europe and beyond. Many of their stories remain classified or unknown. Some agents died without their families ever knowing what they really did. But some stories have emerged, and they're extraordinary. Let's talk about some of the legendary figures associated with Camp X. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, visited Camp X multiple times during the war while working for British naval intelligence. Fleming was fascinated by the training and the agents he met. He later said that William Stephenson, the mastermind behind Camp X, was one of his primary inspirations for James Bond. The character's combination of sophistication, combat skills, and cold professionalism came directly from real agents Fleming observed. But Fleming's Bond novels, while entertaining, actually sanitized and glamorized the reality. Real agents from Camp X didn't wear tuxedos to casinos. They wore shabby clothes and lived in constant danger of exposure. They didn't seduce beautiful women. They lived isolated, paranoid existences. They didn't have gadgets from Q Branch. They improvised with whatever they could find or make. Bill Brooker, a Canadian agent trained at Camp X, parachuted into occupied France and worked with the French resistance organizing sabotage operations. He survived the war despite several close calls with capture. In one incident, he was in a safe house when German soldiers knocked on the door. He hid in a coal bin for 12 hours while Germans searched the building. He later said the training at Camp X in remaining calm under pressure saved his life. Alcide Beauregard was another Canadian trained at Camp X. He was parachuted into France 3 times to organize resistance activities. On his third mission, he was captured by the Gestapo, interrogated, and sent to a concentration camp. He survived and returned to Canada after the war, but never spoke publicly about his experiences. His family only learned the full story after his death when his war records were partially declassified. Women were also trained at Camp X, though in smaller numbers. The SOE recruited women as agents because they could often move through occupied territory more easily than men. There were fewer young men around due to forced labor, so a young man traveling alone attracted suspicion, while a woman might not. These women underwent the same brutal training as the men: close combat, weapons, demolitions, the whole curriculum. They then parachuted into occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other countries, where they organized resistance networks, conducted sabotage, and gathered intelligence. Violet Sabo was a British agent of French descent who may have received some training at Camp X or at related facilities. She was parachuted into France twice, organizing resistance activities and conducting sabotage. On her second mission, she was captured after a gun battle with German troops. She was interrogated, tortured, and eventually executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp in 1945. She was 23 years old. After the war, she was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor for courage. The sabotage operations conducted by Camp X trained agents were remarkably effective. Agents working with resistance networks destroyed railway lines, derailed trains, blew up bridges, sabotaged factories, and killed German officers. Each operation required careful planning, precise execution, and nerves of steel. One operation involved sabotaging a ball bearing factory in occupied France. Ball bearings were critical for German aircraft and tank production. A Camp X-trained agent worked with the French resistance to infiltrate the factory and plant explosives in critical machinery. The explosion destroyed production equipment and set back German tank production by months. The agent escaped and was exfiltrated back to Britain. Another operation targeted German rail communications in Belgium. Agents placed explosives on railway tracks in ways that appeared to be mechanical failures rather than sabotage. This avoided German reprisals against local civilians while still disrupting German troop movements. Assassination operations were among the most dangerous. Some Camp X-trained agents were tasked with killing high-value German targets, officers, Gestapo officials, collaborators. These operations required getting close to the target, killing them quickly, and escaping before German security could respond. One such operation involved assassinating a particularly brutal Gestapo commander in France who had tortured and killed dozens of resistance members. A Camp X trained agent posed as a black marketeer to get close to the commander, killed him with a silenced pistol in a dark alley and disappeared before the body was discovered. Not all operations succeeded. Many agents were captured and killed. Of the agents parachuted into occupied Netherlands, for example, many walked into German traps. The Germans had captured and turned some resistance members and used them to identify incoming agents. Dozens of agents were captured, tortured for information, and executed. The psychological toll on agents was immense. They lived with constant fear of exposure. They couldn't trust anyone completely. They witnessed atrocities and often couldn't intervene without blowing their cover. They made impossible decisions, like whether to warn a village about a German reprisal that would expose their intelligence source, or stay silent and let innocent people die. Some agents broke under the pressure. Some defected or went into hiding. But most carried on mission after mission, knowing each one might be their last. The American connection to Camp X was significant but quiet. Even before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, American intelligence officers were training at Camp X. Roosevelt and his intelligence chiefs knew that America would eventually enter the war and wanted to prepare. William Donovan, who would become the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, visited Camp X and was deeply impressed. OSS agents received training there, and the OSS used Camp X's curriculum as a model for its own training facilities in the United States. After the war, when the CIA was created in 1947, it adopted many of Camp X's training methods. The CIA's training facility, known as the Farm, used a curriculum that was directly descended from Camp X. To this day, CIA operatives learn techniques that were first developed and perfected at Camp X. But despite its importance, Camp X was systematically erased from history, and that erasure is itself part of the story. In late 1944, as Allied victory in Europe became increasingly certain, the focus at Camp X began to shift. Fewer agents were needed for operations in occupied Europe, and planners were already thinking about the post-war world. By 1945, the intense spy training operations at Camp X were largely concluded. Some training continued for agents being deployed to Asia for operations against Japan, but the scale was much smaller. The HYDRA communications station continued operating at full capacity, now handling Cold War intelligence as much as WWII operations. Then came a systematic effort to erase Camp X from history. In 1946, the training facilities were officially closed. Buildings were dismantled or repurposed, equipment was removed. Documents were destroyed or classified at the highest levels. The land was declared surplus and eventually sold to private interests. The Canadian government's official position was that Camp X had been a minor military communications facility, nothing more. When asked, officials would deny that any spy training had taken place there. The facility had simply been a radio station, they claimed. The British government classified all documents related to Camp X and kept them classified for decades. Agents who had trained there were bound by the Official Secrets Act and could face prosecution if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The American government, which had sent intelligence officers to Camp X for training, quietly incorporated the lessons learned into CIA training programs, but never publicly acknowledged the American connection to the facility. For almost 40 years, Camp X existed in a strange limbo. A few people knew it had been important, but the full story was classified and denied. Veterans who had trained there couldn't talk about it. Researchers who tried to investigate faced official denials and classified documents. The land where Camp X had stood was sold and redeveloped. Part of it became a park. Part became industrial property. The buildings were gone. The fences were removed. Within a few years, you couldn't tell that anything significant had ever been there. But secrets rarely stay buried forever. In the 1970s, researchers started piecing together the story from fragments, declassified documents with redactions, interviews with aging veterans who were willing to risk legal consequences to tell their story, and physical evidence from the site. A few brave veterans decided that the story needed to be told while people were still alive who remembered. In 1984, a book called A Man Called Intrepid by William Stevenson, no relation to William Stevenson, told the story of British intelligence operations in North America, including Camp X. The book was controversial. Some claimed it exaggerated or romanticized certain aspects, but it brought Camp X to public attention. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, more documents were gradually declassified. Veterans gave interviews. Historians conducted research. The full picture of Camp X began to emerge. In 1988, a memorial cairn was erected on the approximate location of Camp X, acknowledging its historical importance. Local historians and veterans groups worked to preserve the memory of what had happened there. In 2008, the municipal government of Whitby, Ontario, established an exhibit about Camp X at a local museum. Finally, the story was officially acknowledged and preserved. But much remains unknown. Many documents are still classified. Many agents died without ever telling their stories. Many operations remain secret to this day. The full scope of what Camp X accomplished may never be fully known. Today, the site of Camp X is barely recognizable. A waterfront trail runs through part of the property. Plaques mark the approximate location of key buildings. But if you didn't know what had been there, you would never guess that this peaceful location was once one of the most secret and important facilities of World War II. What is Camp X's legacy? First, it established the model for modern intelligence training. Every Western intelligence services training program descends in some way from the Camp X curriculum. The tradecraft, the combat techniques, the psychological preparation, all of this was pioneered or perfected at Camp X. Second, Camp X demonstrated that intelligence operations could decisively influence the outcome of wars. The agents trained there shortened WWII, saved lives, and gathered intelligence that informed strategic decisions. This lesson wasn't lost on post-war governments. The CIA, the expansion of MI6, the development of special operations forces. All of this flowed from the recognition that Camp X had proven a point. Well-trained agents conducting covert operations are force multipliers. Third, Camp X showed the importance of international intelligence cooperation. British expertise, Canadian resources, and American personnel came together at Camp X to achieve something none could have accomplished alone. This model of Allied intelligence cooperation continues today through organizations like the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Fourth, Camp X reminds us about the price of secrecy. Agents trained there risked everything. Some died, and for decades they couldn't even tell their families what they had done or why it mattered. They served in silence, and many died without recognition. This raises important questions about how we balance national security needs against the human need for acknowledgement and remembrance. And finally, Camp X is a reminder that history is often more extraordinary than fiction. Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, inspired by Camp X, are exciting but sanitized. The real agents from Camp X lived grittier, more dangerous, and often shorter lives. They didn't have gadgets or plot armor. They had training, courage, and often just luck. And many of them didn't make it home. As we stand here today, with only a few aging veterans left who remember Camp X firsthand, we have a responsibility to tell this story. Not to glorify war or espionage, but to honor the sacrifice of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in extraordinary times. The young men and women who trained at Camp X weren't superheroes. They were farmers, factory workers, students, and clerks who volunteered for something they knew was dangerous but believed was necessary. They learned skills that terrified them, went into situations that gave them nightmares, and many never came home. Those who did come home often carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. But they also changed the world. The intelligence they gathered, the operations they conducted, the networks they organized, all of this contributed to defeating Nazi Germany and ending one of the darkest chapters in human history. Camp X existed for only a few years, but its impact resonates through the decades. Every time an intelligence officer goes into the field, every time a special operations team conducts a covert mission, Every time Allied intelligence services cooperate to address a threat, they're using principles and techniques that were pioneered at Camp X. The site may be gone, the buildings demolished, the secrets mostly declassified, but the legacy remains. In the training facilities of intelligence services around the world, in the stories told by the few remaining veterans, in the memorial that stands on the shore of Lake Ontario, and in the acknowledgement finally given that what happened at Camp X mattered. To the agents who trained there, to those who died in the field, to those who carried secrets to their graves, and to those who finally told their stories, thank you. Your service, your sacrifice, and your courage will not be forgotten. Camp X, the secret spy school that changed espionage forever, and the ordinary people who became extraordinary agents. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share. History like this deserves to be remembered and told. The veterans of Camp X served in silence for decades. The least we can do is make sure their story is heard.